In the early hours of October 7th, 1571, the Mediterranean Sea stretched calm and deceptively peaceful beneath the morning mist. Yet beneath that tranquil surface, two mighty fleets prepared for what would become the bloodiest naval battle in human history. The stakes could not have been higher. On one side sailed the crescent banners of the Ottoman Empire, the most feared naval force on earth, commanded by battle-hardened admirals who had terrorized Christian shores for decades. On the other side, an unlikely alliance of Christian powers had united under the papal banner, desperate to halt what seemed like the inevitable Ottoman conquest of Europe itself. What followed would transform the Mediterranean into a churning sea of crimson. Over 40,000 men would die in a single afternoon. Ships would burn like floating funeral pyres. The screams of the wounded would echo across waters, literally turned red with blood. But this was more than just another medieval slaughter. This was the moment when Christian Europe discovered it could fight back against an empire that had seemed unstoppable. This was Lepanto, the battle that changed everything. But to understand why thousands of men willingly sailed to their deaths on that October morning, we must first journey back to the events that made this apocalyptic clash inevitable. For the Ottoman Empire had not simply appeared overnight as Europe's greatest threat. It had methodically, brutally, carved its way across the Mediterranean, leaving behind a trail of enslaved Christians and conquered territories that stretched the length of the sea. The year was 1570, and the island of Cyprus had become the epicenter of Ottoman brutality that would shock even the violence-hardened rulers of medieval Europe. Venice, once the proud mistress of Mediterranean trade, had watched helplessly as Ottoman forces invaded their precious island stronghold. The siege that followed was not merely military conquest. It was systematic savagery designed to break the will of Christian resistance everywhere. At Famagusta, the island's last Christian fortress, Venetian commanders Marcantonio Bragadin and Astore Baglioni held out against impossible odds. Fewer than 10,000 Christian defenders faced an Ottoman army of over 100,000 men. The mathematics of war were brutally simple. This was not a siege. It was an execution waiting to happen. The Christians fought with the desperate courage of men who knew no quarter would be given. They held the walls as long as humanly possible, suffering casualty rates that approached 90%. Bodies piled in the courtyards. Blood ran in rivers through the streets. Still they fought, because they understood what surrender would bring. When the inevitable end came, the Ottoman commander Lala Kara Mustafa Pasha had promised honorable treatment for the surviving defenders. It was a lie that would echo across Europe for generations. Bragadin was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded through the streets. The remaining defenders were butchered or enslaved. The message was clear. This was the fate awaiting any Christian territory that dared resist Ottoman expansion. News of the Cyprus atrocities spread through European courts like wildfire. Kings and princes who had spent decades squabbling among themselves suddenly faced a terrifying reality. The Ottoman Empire was not simply another political rival. It was an existential threat to Christian civilization itself. The systematic brutality displayed at Cyprus demonstrated that this was not merely conquest. It was the methodical erasure of everything Christian Europe represented. In the halls of the Vatican, Pope Pius V understood that desperate times demanded desperate measures. For years he had attempted to forge a coalition of Catholic powers against the Ottoman threat. Time and again, European rulers had proven more interested in fighting each other than confronting their common enemy. But the horrors of Cyprus changed everything. Even the most reluctant monarchs began to realize that they could unite against the Ottomans or face destruction separately. The formation of the Holy League represented something unprecedented in European politics. Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, Tuscany, Savoy, and Malta set aside centuries of rivalry to confront the Turkish menace. It was an alliance born not of shared ambition, but of shared terror. Each member understood that failure meant not just military defeat, but the complete subjugation of Christian Europe. The man chosen to lead this unlikely coalition was Don Juan of Austria, the bastard half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. At just 24 years old, Don Juan possessed the royal blood necessary to command respect from various national contingents, combined with genuine military talent that had already proven itself in campaigns against Muslim forces in Granada. His appointment was politically brilliant. Here was a commander who could unite fractious allies while inspiring the kind of personal loyalty that wins battles. But even as the Holy League assembled its forces, the Ottoman Empire was preparing its own response. Sultan Selim II had not earned his throne through military genius like his predecessors, but he understood the stakes as clearly as any Christian ruler. The loss of Cyprus would represent not just territorial conquest, but proof that Ottoman expansion could not be stopped. More importantly, control of Cyprus would give Turkish forces a permanent base from which to threaten Italian shipping and coastal cities. The Ottoman fleet that sailed from Constantinople in 1571 represented the pinnacle of Turkish naval power. Over 250 ships carrying more than 80,000 men formed a crescent of death that stretched across the horizon. These were not merely soldiers and sailors. They were the veterans of countless Mediterranean campaigns, hardened warriors who had terrorized Christian shores for decades. Their commanders were legends in their own right, men whose very names struck fear into the hearts of European coastal populations. Ali Pasha commanded the center of the Ottoman fleet from his magnificent flagship, the Sultana. A veteran of numerous campaigns, he had earned his position through decades of successful operations against Christian targets. His tactical expertise was matched only by his absolute confidence in Ottoman naval supremacy. After all, when had a Christian fleet ever seriously challenged Turkish dominance at sea? On the Ottoman right flank, Mehmed Siroco brought decades of experience fighting Venetian and Spanish forces. He understood European naval tactics better than almost any other Turkish commander, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the coming battle. His ships carried the elite troops of the Ottoman army, janissaries whose discipline and fighting ability were renowned throughout Europe. Perhaps most dangerous of all was Uluç Ali, commanding the Ottoman left wing. This brilliant tactician had begun his career as a Christian galley slave before converting to Islam and rising through the ranks of the Ottoman navy. His intimate knowledge of both Christian and Muslim naval warfare made him uniquely qualified to exploit any weakness in the enemy formation. European commanders who had faced him in previous encounters spoke of his tactical genius with grudging respect. Yet for all their experience and confidence, the Ottoman commanders were about to encounter something entirely new in Mediterranean naval warfare. The Venetians had developed a revolutionary new type of warship that would fundamentally alter the nature of galley combat. These vessels were called galleasses, and they represented a quantum leap in naval firepower that the Ottomans were completely unprepared for. A galleass combined the maneuverability of traditional Mediterranean galleys with unprecedented artillery power. Each vessel displaced 700 tons and carried a crew of 700 men. Most importantly, they mounted heavy broadside batteries capable of firing 326 pounds of shot, compared to the 90 pounds discharged by a standard galley. These floating fortresses could deliver devastating firepower at ranges that traditional galleys could never match. The technological disparity between the opposing fleets reflected broader differences in military innovation. The Christians possessed an estimated 1,815 guns, compared to only 750 Ottoman cannons. More critically, the Turkish forces lacked sufficient ammunition for a prolonged engagement. European industrial capacity had begun to outpace Ottoman production capabilities, a trend that would only accelerate in coming decades. As both fleets converged on the Gulf of Patras, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Mediterranean. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the full magnitude of the armadas preparing for battle. Drums echoed across the water. Prayers rose from both Christian and Muslim crews. The greatest naval battle in Western history was about to begin. The dawn of October 7th broke with an ominous stillness that veteran sailors recognized as the calm before the storm. Aboard the flagship Real, Don Juan of Austria stood at the prow, his young face etched with the gravity of command. At 24, he carried the hopes of Christian Europe on his shoulders, and the weight of that responsibility was visible in his every gesture. Around him, his officers made final preparations, checking weapons, adjusting armor, blessing themselves with the sign of the cross. The sight that greeted them as the morning mist lifted was both magnificent and terrifying. Across the Gulf of Patras, the Ottoman fleet stretched from shore to shore in a perfect crescent formation, their banners snapping in the breeze, their hulls dark against the silver water. The mathematical reality was sobering. The Turkish force outnumbered the Christian coalition, and their reputation for naval supremacy was built on decades of unbroken victories. Yet Don Juan felt no fear, only the cold clarity that comes to commanders in the moments before battle. The Christian fleet had spent the night in prayer and preparation. Priests had moved among the ships, administering the sacrament to soldiers who knew they might not see another sunset. Galley slaves, both Christian and Muslim, had been freed from their chains and armed with short swords. It was a calculated risk that transformed potential liabilities into motivated fighters. The promise of freedom or death resonated powerfully with men who had nothing left to lose. As the fleets began their approach, the revolutionary galleasses took their positions at the front of the Christian line. These hybrid warships represented a new era in naval warfare, combining the mobility of traditional galleys with the devastating firepower of cannon-armed sailing ships. The Ottoman commanders, observing these unusual vessels from a distance, initially mistook them for supply ships. It was a fatal miscalculation that would cost them dearly in the opening moments of battle. The Turkish fleet advanced with the confidence born of countless victories. Their formation was a masterpiece of naval tactics, designed to envelop and crush the smaller Christian force through superior numbers and maneuverability. The crescent shape allowed the Ottoman wings to sweep around their enemies, while the powerful center drove straight through the heart of the Christian line. It was a formation that had never failed them before. But as the distance closed, something extraordinary began to happen. The wind, which had been blowing against the Christian fleet all morning, suddenly shifted. Sails that had hung limp against their masts now billowed with divine breath, driving the Holy League ships forward with unexpected speed. The Ottomans, caught off guard by this meteorological reversal, were forced to strike their own sails and rely solely on oar power. The first shots of the battle erupted from the galleasses at a range of nearly a mile. The thunderous roar of their cannons shattered the morning silence, sending iron balls crashing into the advancing Ottoman formation. The effect was immediate and devastating. Turkish galleys, built for speed and maneuverability rather than absorbing heavy gunfire, began to splinter and sink under the unprecedented barrage. What followed was unlike anything Mediterranean warfare had ever witnessed. The galleasses alone were credited with sinking up to 70 Ottoman vessels in the opening phase of battle. More importantly, their devastating fire disrupted the careful Turkish formation just as the main engagement was about to commence. Ships collided with each other as captains desperately tried to avoid the killing zone around the Christian superweapons. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. Ottoman sailors and soldiers who had never faced such concentrated firepower found themselves confronting a new and terrifying reality. The age of galley warfare, where victory went to the side with the most skilled rowers and marines, was ending before their eyes. This was industrial warfare in its infancy, where superior technology could overcome numerical advantage and traditional tactics. As the fleets finally closed to ramming distance, the battle transformed into a series of individual duels between opposing galleys. Ships crashed together with splintering impacts that could be heard across the water. Boarding parties leaped from deck to deck, swords flashing in the morning sunday. The narrow confines of galley warfare meant that every engagement became intensely personal, with men fighting hand-to-hand in spaces barely wide enough for a dozen warriors. The flagship duel between Don Juan's Real and Ali Pasha's Sultana became the focal point of the entire battle. These two magnificent vessels, representing the cream of their respective fleets, closed with each other like gladiators in an aquatic arena. The Real, with its complement of Spanish veterans and Italian marines, faced the Sultana, carrying the elite janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. The collision between the two flagships sent shockwaves through both fleets. Grappling hooks flew through the air, lashing the vessels together until their decks formed a single bloody battlefield. Don Juan himself fought in the front ranks, his gilded armor making him a target for every Turkish marksman. Ali Pasha, equally conspicuous in his silk robes and jeweled turban, rallied his men with shouts that echoed across the water. For hours the battle raged with a ferocity that defied human endurance. Decks became slippery with blood as men fell by the dozens. The air filled with the clash of steel on steel, the screams of the wounded, and the prayers of the dying. Neither flagship could gain a decisive advantage as wave after wave of reinforcements poured onto the contested decks. But gradually, the superior firepower of the Christian forces began to tell. Ottoman galleys, designed for the traditional tactics of ramming and boarding, found themselves outgunned by vessels equipped with modern artillery. The systematic destruction of Turkish ships created gaps in their formation that Christian captains were quick to exploit. What had begun as an orderly battle of formations devolved into a chaotic melee where individual courage and superior weapons determined outcomes. On the northern flank, Venetian commander Agostino Barbarigo faced the challenging task of preventing Ottoman forces from outflanking the Christian line near the shore. His intimate knowledge of coastal waters allowed him to position his galleys in the treacherous shallows where larger Turkish vessels dared not follow. The fighting here was particularly savage, as both sides understood that control of this sector would determine whether the Christians could maintain their defensive formation. The liberation of Christian galley slaves aboard captured Ottoman vessels added a dramatic new element to the battle. These men, who had endured years of bondage and brutality, fought with the desperate courage of those who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their intimate knowledge of Turkish ship layouts and crew dispositions proved invaluable as they turned captured vessels into weapons against their former captors. As the afternoon sun reached its zenith, the Mediterranean had indeed turned red with blood. Thousands of bodies floated among the wreckage of shattered galleys. The water itself seemed to have changed color, stained crimson by the unprecedented carnage that marked this collision of civilizations. The tide of battle had reached its crescendo, but the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. While the Christian center held firm around the epic duel between the flagships, disaster loomed on the southern flank, where the most brilliant Ottoman commander was about to demonstrate why he was feared throughout the Mediterranean. Uluç Ali, the converted Christian slave who had risen to become one of the empire's greatest naval tacticians, had been watching the battle unfold with calculating eyes. Where other Ottoman commanders had charged headlong into the devastating firepower of the Galleasses, Uluç Ali recognized the trap. His years of experience fighting both for and against Christian forces had taught him to exploit weaknesses that others might miss. As the Genoese commander Andrea Doria extended his line to prevent encirclement, Uluç Ali saw his opportunity. Like a wolf circling wounded prey, he began to maneuver his squadron away from the main engagement. The Genoese admiral fell for the deception perfectly. Fearing that the Ottomans would sweep around his flank and attack the Christian rear, Doria ordered his ships to pursue Uluç Ali toward open water. It was exactly what the Turkish commander had hoped for. As the gap in the Christian line widened, Uluç Ali suddenly reversed course with 16 of his fastest galleys, driving like a spear point straight into the heart of the Holy League formation. The Maltese squadron bore the full brunt of this unexpected assault. These were no ordinary sailors and soldiers, but the legendary Knights of St. John, warrior monks, whose courage was matched only by their skill at arms. Their flagship, commanded by Pietro Giustiniani, found itself surrounded by Ottoman galleys in a desperate fight for survival that would become the stuff of legend. The assault on the Maltese galley was a masterpiece of coordinated violence. Wave after wave of janissaries hurled themselves across the bloodied decks, only to be met by the unwavering resistance of knights who had sworn to defend Christendom with their lives. Giustiniani himself fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting down Turkish warriors even as arrows pierced his armor. When the smoke cleared, he remained standing against the mainmast with 5 arrows embedded in his body, surrounded by over 300 enemy dead. But Uluç Ali's brilliant maneuver had achieved more than the capture of a single galley. His penetration of the Christian center threatened to split the Holy League fleet in two, potentially turning victory into catastrophic defeat. Panic began to ripple through the Christian ranks as captains realized their formation was collapsing. The carefully planned battle line that had seemed so strong moments before was fragmenting under the pressure of superior Ottoman seamanship. At this crucial moment, The Spanish reserve under the Marquis of Santa Cruz proved its worth. These veteran commanders had been holding back their forces, waiting for exactly such a crisis. As Uluç Ali's galleys pressed deeper into the Christian formation, Santa Cruz unleashed his ships in a coordinated counterattack that demonstrated why Spanish naval discipline was renowned throughout Europe. The collision between the Spanish reserve and Uluç Ali's penetrating force created a whirlpool of violence in the center of the battle. Ships crashed together with such force that their hulls splintered, sending men tumbling into the blood-stained waters. The narrow space between opposing vessels became a killing ground, where soldiers fought with increasing desperation as the battle's momentum shifted back and forth. Meanwhile, the flagship duel that had captivated both fleets was reaching its climax. Don Juan and Ali Pasha had been locked in combat for hours, neither able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. The decks of both vessels were carpeted with the dead and dying, yet still the fighting continued with undiminished fury. Spanish steel met Turkish scimitar in a dance of death that seemed to embody the larger struggle between Christianity and Islam. The turning point came not through superior tactics or individual heroism, but through the gradual accumulation of technological advantage. The Christian forces, with their superior artillery and better equipped soldiers, began to wear down their Ottoman opponents through sheer firepower. Turkish galleys, magnificent as they were, had not been designed to withstand the concentrated bombardment that the galleasses and heavily armed Christian vessels could deliver. As the afternoon wore on, the systematic destruction of Ottoman ships became increasingly apparent. Where once the Turkish crescent had stretched unbroken across the Gulf, gaps began to appear as vessel after vessel fell victim to Christian guns. The survivors found themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded by enemies who showed no mercy to those who had terrorized Christian shores for so long. The death of Ali Pasha marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman resistance. The great admiral fell with an arrow through his forehead, his magnificent turban tumbling into the crimson waters as his body crashed to the deck. The sight of their commander's death sent shockwaves through the Turkish center, and morale began to crumble as rapidly as their battle formation. Don Juan, seizing the psychological moment, ordered Ali Pasha's head displayed on a pike at the bow of the Real. The gruesome trophy was visible across the water, a brutal symbol that the seemingly invincible Ottoman navy could indeed be defeated. Turkish captains who had fought with unwavering courage suddenly found their resolve shaken as they contemplated the fate of their supreme commander. The collapse of the Ottoman center triggered a chain reaction throughout their fleet. Ships that had been holding their positions in disciplined formation suddenly broke ranks, each captain deciding that survival outweighed honor. The careful tactical deployment that had served the Turkish navy so well for decades dissolved into chaos as individual vessels fled toward the safety of open water. But escape was not so easily achieved. The Christian galleasses, those revolutionary instruments of maritime destruction, had positioned themselves to cut off the most obvious retreat routes. Their guns continued to thunder across the water, sending iron death into the ranks of fleeing Ottoman vessels. Many Turkish galleys, damaged in the earlier fighting, simply could not maintain the speed necessary to outrun their pursuers. The liberation of Christian slaves aboard captured Ottoman vessels added a particularly savage element to the pursuit. These men, freed from years of bondage, showed no mercy to their former captors. The sight of Turkish sailors being cut down by the very Christians they had enslaved sent a powerful message across both fleets. The natural order of Mediterranean warfare, where Ottoman victory was assumed, had been completely reversed. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the magnitude of the Christian victory became undeniable. The sea around the Gulf of Patras had literally turned red with blood, fulfilling the most apocalyptic predictions of the battle's chroniclers. Wreckage from hundreds of ships dotted the water, while thousands of bodies floated among the debris like grim testimony to the day's carnage. The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Over 30,000 Ottoman soldiers and sailors lay dead in the water, their dreams of European conquest sinking beneath the crimson waves. The Christian losses, though significant at 8,000 men, paled in comparison to the destruction visited upon their enemies. It was a casualty ratio that spoke to the devastating effectiveness of superior firepower and tactical coordination. Yet the true significance of Lepanto extended far beyond mere numbers of dead and wounded. For the first time in living memory, a Christian fleet had not merely survived an encounter with Ottoman naval power, but had utterly destroyed it. The psychological impact of this reversal would echo across both Christian and Muslim worlds for generations to come. In the palaces of European capitals, news of the victory would be received with jubilation bordering on disbelief. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed destined to sweep across the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe itself, had been revealed as mortal after all. The crescent banners that had struck fear into Christian hearts for centuries now lay beneath the waves, testament to the power of united resolve and superior technology. But perhaps most significantly, Lepanto marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. The age of galley combat, where victory depended on the courage of boarding parties and the skill of oarsmen, was giving way to the age of gunpowder and artillery. The galleasses that had proven so decisive would evolve into the sailing ships of the line that would dominate naval warfare for the next 3 centuries. As darkness began to fall over the blood-soaked waters of the Mediterranean, both victors and vanquished struggled to comprehend what had transpired. The survivors would carry their memories of this day to their graves, haunted by visions of ships consumed by fire and seas turned crimson with human blood. Lepanto had indeed changed everything, but at a cost that would be measured in nightmares as much as in strategic advantage. When the last cannon fell silent and the dying echoes of battle faded across the bloodied waters, the Mediterranean world had been forever transformed. October 7th, 1571 marked not just the end of a single day's fighting, but the end of an era. The Ottoman Empire's dream of European conquest lay shattered among the wreckage floating in the Gulf of Patras, while Christian Europe awakened to the stunning realization that their seemingly invincible enemy could indeed be defeated. The young Don Juan of Austria had achieved something that generations of European commanders had thought impossible. Through revolutionary technology, unprecedented cooperation, and sheer determination, the Holy League had turned the tide of history itself. 15,000 Christian slaves had been freed from Ottoman galleys, their chains broken by the same cannons that had painted the sea red with Turkish blood. Yet Lepanto's true legacy extended far beyond that October afternoon. It proved that unity could triumph over division, that innovation could overcome tradition, and that even the mightiest empires could fall when confronted by those willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. The battle that turned the Mediterranean red with blood had also washed away the myth of Ottoman invincibility forever. In a single day, the balance of power in the ancient sea had shifted, and Europe would never again cower before the crescent banner of the Sultan.